Hi. Well, we're going to start looking at John Polkinghorne's book, Science and Creation, The Search for Understanding. As you know, it's one of the pre-U set texts for philosophy and theology, and it's quite an exciting project. He tries to do several things in it, and over the course of the next 6 or 7 videos, we'll be looking at it closely, chapter by chapter, and breaking down some of its themes. So just a little bit about Mr. Polkinghorne, or I should say Sir John Polkinghorne. He was born in 1930, as you see from the slides there. At the time of writing, 2020, he's currently alive, as far as we know. Hopefully hasn't been a victim of the coronavirus. And as you see, he basically had an education as a natural scientist at Cambridge University before becoming a priest. So that's his background, and it's important to note he actually does talk about his background. He's coming to these sets of questions from, firstly, a position of faith, and secondly, from an intellectual and academic background as a theoretical physicist. So, what is this book about? Well, he has a project, and that is to propose a revised natural theology. Natural theology, as you know, attempts to further explore and understand God through the created world. What he does is to propose a complementary model of science and religion in our epistemological quest. So don't forget the subtitle, The Search for Understanding. When he means understanding, he means a sort of full comprehension of the world, as in the universe, and everything in it as far as is possible. So the themes that I've highlighted for us are epistemology and natural theology, goes without saying. The intelligibility of the world is something that he assumes. So he thinks that the world is able to be understood by us, and he thinks that that's hugely significant. He looks at the doctrine of God, so who is God and what can we know about him? He discusses the mind-body problem and the nature of reality, what that actually is in existence. And a big theme and thesis of his is the openness of the world. He talks about the ontological openness of the world, to be and to be slightly autonomous, which is something that we'll unpack later, particularly in chapter 3, which for some people is the most challenging of the chapters to look at. So, in terms of the structure of the book, it's only 117 pages, so it's not very, very long. He breaks it down into 6 chapters, and you should try to learn the titles of those 6 chapters because it will help you understand the structure of the book. So as you see in the slides there, the first chapter is called Natural Theology, and it's really where he just gives us a survey of what has gone before him in terms of the historical attempts to look at or to deduce or induce at least knowledge of God from his creation, so Paley, etc. And he says, well, look, since Paley, we can't really do the kind of natural theology that he did because that was susceptible to the God of the gaps criticism, and especially since Darwin came along and pulled the rug, if you like, from under Paley's feet. We've got to instead do a new kind of theology because we've got a new or fresh insights from science about the world. So it would be very odd to carry on in the same way as before. In chapter 2, Insightful Inquiry, he talks really about the scientific method as a template for all inquiry, and he starts with the just a little anecdote about Newton, and he talks a lot about epistemology, about systems that we build up, about the assumptions that different disciplines make. The third chapter is probably the most challenging. It's called Order and Disorder. You see again some sort of binary oppositions there. We'll talk about binary oppositions throughout the text. He brings what seem to be opposed to each other into some sort of fruitful relationship. And it's quite technical, so there's a lot of sort of physics in there. You don't have to know or understand the intricacies of the physics. You have to appreciate how he's using these as examples to talk about the structure of the world or the universe, and how he then interprets it in chapter 4, which is creation and creator. And note, it's that way round. Creation is first, not because it's ontologically first, of course, that would be absurd, but because it's through the inspection of creation that we can come to know the Creator. That's the whole project of natural theology. So essentially, these two chapters that stand in the centre of the book are really his most important, I suppose, thesis, and they go hand in glove. The 5th chapter takes on the mind-body problem. It's called The Nature of Reality, and he takes a survey of materialism and idealism and dualism, and he tries to propose his own complementary model of dualism, but one that isn't the same, he says, as Cartesian dualism or Platonism, and we'll see whether we think that he's successful. The 6th chapter is really a conclusion, and he just says, well, look, there you go, science and theology both complement each other. They both need each other, actually. He says that science is only part of the story, and essentially so is theology, but together they are science in the Latin sense of knowledge. And so he famously says that physics needs metaphysics to reach its intellectually satisfying conclusion. So that's the structure of the text, and unlike some of your other set texts, where it's really just one theme, Polkinghorne's book is a little bit more bitty, or it can be compartmentalized. So just be aware of that structure. Some definitions for us and his essential theses. Essentially, these are really important quotations that I think you should kind of try to learn. So it's quite important to know what his definition of natural theology is, and as you see here, it may be defined as the search for the knowledge of God by the exercise of reason and the inspection of the world. So this isn't just any old knowledge, it's knowledge as it pertains to God, and it's not that we just look at a tree and say, oh, hooray, Jesus Christ. No, we look at a tree and we apply our reason to it, and we think about how the world works at its fundamental level in terms of quantum physics, as well as Newtonian physics, and that will help us, says Polkinghorne, to understand more about its maker. The God of the Gaps is dead. This is from the 1st chapter again, and with him has died the old style natural theology of Paley. So he sees himself as, I suppose, something of a successor to Paley, who was a naturalist and tried to induce, or possibly deduce, but I think we'd have to agree, induce things about God from the creation. But he was working in a Newtonian system, and before, of course, the theory of evolution. He talks a lot about the relationship between science and theology in sort of sibling terms. So here, a fraternal relationship. Elsewhere, he's going to talk about twin disciplines. They also share a comradely concern. So we'll talk about his metaphors here. But note that what this suggests is that they are essentially both epistemologically of the same stock. They're both coming from this thirst for understanding, this quest to know, and they're different, of course, as brothers are different, but they belong to the same family, if you like. So they complement each other rather than go against each other. From chapter 3, this is his essential idea about the nature of our universe. It is the realm not only of order but of disorder. So he sees these two things being both true, which is a bit like the complementary nature of science and religion. I've mentioned this before, but that the world is intelligible is surely a non-trivial fact about it. So it's basically quite important. We cannot ignore the fact that we do understand, to an extent, the world. And then in chapter 4, when he's talking more about God, he says that in the act of creation, God makes room for something other than himself. So Polkinghorne sees creation as an act of gratuitous grace, even that isn't tautologous. It's an outpouring of God's love in which he steps back and allows things that are not him to be. It's important that you understand Polkinghorne's concept of God and his limitations, if any. His limitations are merely logical limitations, so he agrees with Aquinas here. But there's an interesting sort of a question about where he stands on the Euthyphro dilemma, which we'll unpack later. So the rational God must respect reason. And here I've put matter must have its destiny along with men, because some people accuse the natural theologians of being a little bit anthropocentric, of focusing too much on human beings, or even on the earth. And certainly Polkinghorne wants to go well beyond the scope of earth, but also well beyond the scope of human beings. The 6th chapter has this little soundbite: every image of God is ultimately an idol. And I think it hints towards theological language, but here I think Polkinghorne is warning us that whenever we think that we've got God, we haven't, because in understanding something that is so far beyond us, we have to essentially dumb it down to our level. So we have to speak of God in human terms, and he talks about a web of anthropomorphism, and we can bring in some Descartes, and in fact will do so. But he mentions this in the introduction, really, and it's the theme that he returns to. So at the end, after all the fruitful inquiry, we've got to recognise the barrier, the epistemological barrier to our understanding of something that is essentially transcendent and therefore cannot really be apprehended by us. We are always in danger of constructing things that are essentially not God. So those are what I consider to be, in a nutshell, some of the most important quotations from the book that highlight his essential ideas. Now, a word before we get going: you need to annotate your texts, and I would suggest that you should do a few things as you see here. So firstly, you should definitely highlight bits of your book. So if you look through my copy of the book, you'll see that at various places I've highlighted it with different colours. And the key that I have is that pink represents bits of science stuff. Yellow is where he is talking about other people. He's either citing them or quoting them. And green are the important points that he is making. Choose some colour schemes, decide a key, stick to it. It will help you understand your own notes when you come to reread them. If you aren't already using these other shorthand annotations, then I would urge you to use CF, which means confer. So this is when you think, oh, that sounds exactly like so-and-so, you put CF, Descartes, for example. CP is short for compare, and that's where you think, yeah, it's kind of similar to so-and-so's idea, but of course their idea is slightly different. CP would be a good thing to jot down in your margin there. Contra just means against, so this is where you note that he is saying something that is very much against someone else's point. And then when I'm reading a text and I think that sounds like an important soundbite or an important point, I put a Q in the margin. If I think it's very important, possibly the most important thing on that page or in that next couple of pages, I put QQ. If I think that it's worth my recalling sort of immediately and committing to memory there and then, because I can foresee that it's going to be a really extremely important point throughout the whole text or for the whole book, and then I'll put 3 Qs in the margin. I would urge you to do something similar and then go about actually learning these quotations and sound bites, because it will show everybody that you actually have read and understood and have got to grips and engaged with the book instead of just a series of lectures about the book. Other things that you can do, I'll leave it up to you. I will often, if something is quite complicated, just jot down at the top of the page what these pages are about. I underline and rule off little sections of the text. I definitely write things that are reminding me of where else in the book things occur. I put question marks if I don't understand something. I put ticks if I agree with it. I write no if I disagree, etc. So the rest is really up to you. Okay, well, I think that we should get going. So, the introduction. In a nutshell, all he's doing in the introduction, as you might expect, is he's laying out his thesis that science and religion have a fraternal relationship. He tells a little bit about his background. He thinks that science can be a little bit more precise than theology can in some regards. And then he says, look, this is what I'm going to talk about. And he just gives us a very quick summary of the 6 chapters. So you might think it's not that interesting, but actually you'd be wrong. It contains important definition, a couple of really good sound bites. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to read the introduction, and as I do so, I'm going to pause where I think that there are some things that need a bit of further explanation. So I'm going to slide over the screen here, and we can read this together. Introduction. When I gave up being a professional physicist and became an Anglican priest, my life altered in many ways. Yet there were certain continuities amid the flux of change. What attracts young men and women to the study of the physical world and holds them to it despite the weariness and frustration inherent in research is the marvellous way in which that world is open to our understanding. I am somewhat an adherent of the great man theory of the history of science, that it is the insights of the men of genius which really propel the subject. But even those of us who only belong to the army of honest toilers share in the excitement as the pattern of nature is laid bare to human inquiry. In the 1950s, the new particles discovered in cosmic rays were found to behave in ways that seemed more and more puzzling and perverse. Then Li and Yang came along and suggested that maybe there is a preference in nature for the left hand over the right. Suddenly, what threatened to be a perplexing chaos became a scene of beautiful order. One can live on the intellectual satisfaction of having been a spectator of such an act of insight for quite a long time. It is the desire to understand the world that motivates all those who work in fundamental physics. A similar desire is part of the inspiration for the religious quest. Of course, the Nicene Creed and Chalcedonian definition do not encapsulate God and Christ in the way that Clerk Maxwell could lay bare the essentials of electromagnetism when he wrote down his famous equation. The reality of God so far transcends our finite grasp that he will never be held by our intellect in such a way. Let's pause there. So, the Nicene Creed and Chalcedonian definition. He's here talking about Christology. And let me just go to PowerPoint and explain a little bit about Christology. So, Christology, as you might guess from the word, logos meaning word or talk about, and Christ is obviously Christ. So it's sort of talk about Christ, but really this is concerned with who is Jesus Christ. Was he just a nice chap, or is he more important than that? And there are two main views about how Christology developed in the church. The first, represented by this sort of rather bad line graph in blue, is to suggest that there was a gradual development of Christology over time. So, Jesus dies and everybody's sort of sad about that, and they think, Jesus was a nice chap. It's a shame that he's dead. He was a good teacher, wasn't he? And then maybe around St. Paul, people think, maybe Jesus was actually a prophet. He was more important than just a teacher. And then by the time we have maybe the fourth gospel being written around AD 90 perhaps, the sense that Jesus was in fact more than a prophet, probably something like an intermediary figure, until we reach the idea, maybe, as they passing around the jam sandwiches at some sort of conference or so, maybe Jesus is the Son of God. It's very good, very good, very good. I thought of that. Very excellent, excellent. And then it takes until the Council of Nicaea, which is in AD 325, to recognise that Jesus is actually God incarnate. And it's like, whoa, what an awesome insight. So that is one view. The other view is that the earliest Christology was always the highest. So that very, very early on, within the Jesus tradition, we have a belief that Jesus is God. And there's some good evidence to support this. Richard Baucham's book, God Crucified, I recommend as an exposition of his thesis that the earliest Christology was the highest. He appeals to Jewish monotheism. It's quite comprehensive. It's also quite short. It's about 80 pages long. He points to, for example, the Christ hymn in Philippians 2, which seems to have a high Christology and is almost certainly Paul citing an early Christian source from within a couple of decades of Jesus' death. So that's just a bit of background. Now, I mentioned the Council of Nicaea. In 325, there was this church council. So as you can appreciate, there are different Christians, different groups of Christians across the world. And there was some disagreement about who this Jesus was, what they should believe. And so they came together essentially to sort of say, well, we think that if you believe that Jesus was created, then you don't belong in the church, etc. That's the so-called Arian heresy. And there are other various heresies that they had to kind of sort out. And essentially, it took some while, but they settled on something called hypostatic union. So what they're doing is they're borrowing a lot of Greek terminology and they're creating new theological concepts and terminology from those other ones. And here we see in Greek the bit that is pertinent for us, and in the one Lord Jesus Christ, the one and only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father, light from light, God from God, begotten not made, of one being with the Father, or of one substance. And there's this word here, homoousion, to patri. Homo comes from the Greek form meaning same, and ousion is substance, so same substance, quite literally. So this is the idea that Jesus isn't a separate God or being, but is ontologically truly God. And those of you who go to church regularly might recognise those words from the Nicene Creed, which is still said today in many Christian churches. So that's literally the declaration of faith. And you remember that the Nicene Creed is, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, etc. And it is a statement declaring, this is how we understand our faith to be. Now, the Chalcedonian definition was, as you see from the date here, a little bit later in 451 AD. This was following the Council of Chalcedon. You can Wikipedia this. There's a pretty good Wikipedia entry on it, which is where this comes from. And here is the quotation of the actual, the English translation of the definition here. So that is essentially what Polkinghorne is referring to in this document here. So he's saying about the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition do not encapsulate God and Christ in the way that Clerk Maxwell. So we don't need to go into the physics of Maxwell, but essentially Maxwell is able to encapsulate, to completely contain the concepts of electromagnetism by some formula, but also by some equations. But we can't encapsulate God in this. Just look at the wording of this, how verbose it really is. Truly God and truly man, the self-same of a rational soul and body, co-essential with the Father according to the Godhead, the self-same co-essential with us according to the manhood, like us in all things, sin apart, before the ages begotten of the Father, but in those last days the self-same and for us, blah, 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 blah. It's incredibly long, this definition, and it's because, I suppose, we lack the adequate words to express something essentially ineffable, not being able to be expressed, because what we're talking about is a transcendent being and a transcendent reality. And I think Polkinghorne wants to, from the outset, recognise that great difficulty. So that's where in your text you should make a note of this. And I've written C.F. Descartes here, and that's because, as you will remember, Descartes says, it is in the nature of the infinite not to be comprehended by me who am finite. Well, let's move on then. And we're going to have to go to the next page. So, over the page, our encounter with him, God, involves deeper levels within us than that of the rational mind alone, and it demands a total response of obedience and worship. Nevertheless, the search for understanding will be incomplete if it does not include within itself the religious quest, for otherwise it will leave fundamental questions of significance and purpose unaddressed and answered. Here is the point of continuity between the life of the physicist and the life of the priest, or better, between the scientific and theological questionings always contemporaneously present within one person. And I would just say to note this idea here of Polkinghorne's, because in one person I would kind of make a reference to chapter 5, where he talks about the mind-body problem and this idea of a dual sort of nature here. Okay, he then does some self-advertising. So I wrote my book One World, I'm sure it's available on Amazon, to assert the unity of our search for understanding of the world in which we live. The book had two main thrusts to its argument. One was to discern the true natures of science and theology. Both are responses to the way things are, and both proceed by conjoining logical analysis with intuitive acts of judgment. Ultimately, each must defend its claim to be in touch with reality by an appeal to the coherent intelligibility it achieves through its insights. Science and theology have a fraternal relationship, and they are complementary rather than antithetic disciplines. I put one Q in the margin, but actually I think this deserves two. This is a very important point. Yet each surveys the one world of experience from its own perspective, and therefore there are possible points of contact or even conflict between them. So he's not saying that there isn't any points of clash between science and theology. That would be absurd. There certainly are, but they're still trying to do the same thing, right? They're still trying to understand the world. The second thrust of my book was to consider the ways in which these two views of the world impinge upon each other, and to suggest that their mutual interaction, though not free from puzzle, is in fact fruitful and enhancing. In the present volume, I seek to carry the matter further. In One World, the appeal was largely to very general theological ideas and the coherent order of fundamental physics. Now my concern is to make contact with certain specific aspects of theological thinking and to explore those features in the physical world that arise from the behaviour of complex physical systems. If it is true that theology is no mere speculative system, but a response to what is, then surely you will always be in need of cool appraisal of the world it seeks to understand. Natural theology, the search for God through the exercise of reason and the inspection of the world, note that is his definition of natural theology, is then not an optional extra for indulgence by the scientifically inclined, but rather it is an indispensable part of theological inquiry. Chapter 1 seeks to confirm this view by a survey of the long history of natural theology, even among people as temperamentally averse to it as the ancient Hebrews, and of its revival today, despite the hesitations and timidity of many theologians. The quest for sufficient reason and a comprehensive understanding of the world drives the physicists to seek unified theories that consolidate the forces of nature into a single grand scheme. The order and balance of the world so discerned often seems to speak of there being more to the universe than has met his scientific eye. Physics needs metaphysics for its intellectually satisfying completion. Here's another soundbite for us. I wonder what you think he means there. What I think I think I like the poetry of that sentence. Metaphysics is simply above physics. Remember, it comes from the book that Aristotle writes. He wrote a book of physics, and then he wrote a book after physics, and he called it After Physics, or Beyond Physics. Meta meaning beyond or above, after. But it's not an optional extra in either direction, is essentially what he's saying. If we're trying to understand stuff, if we're trying to understand everything, then we can't just stop with the physical world, and we can't ignore it either. So, continuing, the evaluation of such a feeling calls for a careful discussion of significance, and coincidence with Chapter 2 seeks to supply. At its close, it draws on the thought of Bernard Lonergan, for whom the search for understanding through and through is truly the search for God. The world of fundamental physics has about it an air of timeless order. Its fitting God might appear to be the God of Aristotle in his unchanging perfection and his impersonal remoteness, or alternatively the verified pantheism of Spinoza's Deus sive natura, as in God appearing or indistinct from nature, which Einstein says was his deity. Yet out of that world of being which fundamental physics describes, there arises the everyday world of becoming, the world of our direct experience, a world of disorder as well as order, whose fitting God is closer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Note that very specific sort of deity here, and this sort of personal God versus the God of Aristotle, who is of course not at all personal. This level shift from being to becoming, from dynamics to thermodynamics, to put it in physical terms, has become much better understood in recent years through the work of Ilya Prigogine and others. The modern conception of a world in which chance and necessity, symmetry and its spontaneous breakdown interlace with each other is presented in Chapter 3, perhaps the most demanding part of the book, and it certainly is. Final page of this chapter. This picture of the evolutionary process of the world poses certain questions for the Christian doctrine of creation. God is no longer seen as the cosmic craftsman in complete control of his products and their consequences. Chapter 4 argues that the lawful necessity of the universe is to be understood as a reflection of God's faithfulness, while the role of chance in the world's process is a reflection of the precariousness inescapable in the gift of freedom by love. And I think it's worth, again, highlighting this idea, freedom by love, because for Polkinghorne, it is in giving the world autonomy that God shows himself to be this God of love. And in that way, he might be able to possibly answer the problem of evil, because it's about freedom. love. So we can compare his ideas actually in terms of the doctrine of creation to John Hick, which is of course the other set text on this side of the course in this paper. But let's just finish this introduction now. Such ideas prove strikingly consonant with the thoughts of W.H. Vanston, arising from his consideration of the nature and costliness of creativity. They also relate to the endeavours of modern theologians such as Walls and Moltmann, who seek to find a place within deity for both time and eternity, being and becoming. And do make sure you just highlight that as another of these binary oppositions that we'll pick up along the way. So if the twin disciplines of science and theology are to be united in fruitful harmony together with those other insights such as art that lie between them in the spectrum of human inquiry, then one must attempt to find an account of reality capable of accommodating so wide a breadth of knowledge and experience. Chapter 5 rejects a materialist reductionism or a retreat into idealism or the unintegrated domains of Cartesian dualism. In their place, it tentatively proposes a complementary metaphysic of mind-matter. The relations of these ideas to Moltmann's creative heaven and Popper's world 3 are noted and discussed. If reason is, as John McMurray said, the capacity to behave in terms of the nature of the object, then both science and theology aspire to such a rationality. Chapter 6 discusses the resulting similarities and also the necessary difference between the subjects. It seeks to illustrate how a scientifically minded person approaches the task of if reason is, as John McMurray said, the capacity to behave in terms of the nature of the object, then both science and theology aspire to such a rationality. Chapter 6 discusses the resulting similarities and also the necessary differences between the two subjects. It seeks to illustrate how a scientifically minded person approaches the task of theological inquiry, conceived as the search for understanding, by making the work of Christ the key to Christology and showing how the Incarnation is the perfect fusion of symbol and event, of fact and interpretation. Thus endeth the introduction.